I don't have much time because I'm just an introducer, but I'm very excited about the introduction today because I have often said time and again when I'm speaking of education that if we continue to think that we are going to change the educational world by simply nibbling around the edges, we are absolute fools and we deserve the results that we get. We need dramatic change, and the gentleman that's going to speak to us today is going to talk about that. But I want to say a couple words that I hope we will all accept. These are nonpartisan words, just accept as these are the general truths, and these truths are important to recognize because it's only once we fully recognize, appreciate these truths, do we realize that change on a monumental scale in education is absolutely necessary. So I'll say these and introduce our guest, and I'm here to learn today as well. We live in a world of intense global competition. There is no doubt about that. The Chinese, the Indians are graduating 7 times more engineers and scientists than the United States. By the way, we are the most heavily indebted nation in the history of mankind. But the good news is we are Americans. We're the most entrepreneurial people on earth. But we've got to be equipped to compete in this world. The future belongs to the educated and the free, and that is our opportunity that stands before us. Our speaker today is Michael Horn. He is the co-founder and executive director of the education of Innosight Institute, a not-for-profit think tank developed to applying the theories of disruptive innovation to the problems in the social sector. He is the co-author of the 2008 book, Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the Way the World Learns. Business Week named it one of the 10 best innovation and design books of 2008. Strategy and Business awarded it the best human capital book of 2008. Newsweek named it as the 14th book on the list of the 50 books of our times. And the National Chamber Foundation named it first among its 10 books that drive the debate of 2009. Disrupting Class uses a theory of disruptive innovation to identify the root causes of school struggles and suggest a path forward to customize education for every child in the way he or she learns. Mr. Horn has been a featured keynote speaker at many conferences, including the Virtual School Symposium and Microsoft School on the Future World Summit. Mr. Horn worked at America Online during its AOL.com relaunch. He has written articles for numerous publications, including Education Week, Forbes, the Boston Globe, and U.S. News and World Report. He earned his MBA from Harvard Business School and his bachelor's degree from Yale University. Good schools, they don't play too good at football. Where he graduated with distinction in history. So please give a warm welcome to our friend, Michael Horn.
Thank you so much. With that introduction, it's tough to follow the speakers, Senator, of course, yourself, and then having Mr. Marcus and Dr. Goodman right before. It's a tough act to follow, especially when you've heard some legitimate bashing of the Harvard Business School, I think, now on 2 fronts. Both we don't play good football and we have some other problems. It's interesting. When we set out to write this book, Disrupting Class, I authored it with this professor at the business school. His name is Clayton Christensen. And Dr. Christensen's career got started in the late 80s when, after having built a business as an entrepreneur and taken it public, he said, you know, I sort of want to go into academia. And he entered the Harvard Business School with a question, which was, I wonder why successful organizations fail. And it's an interesting question if you step back about it for a moment and think about it, because why bad organizations fail, that's fairly obvious. But why successful ones with great employees, great processes, great businesses, track records, and so forth, why they fail is a lot less obvious. And yet, if you think about it through the sweep of history, that's what we see consistently. The organizations that are once at the top a generation or 2 later invariably seem to slip and be in the middle of the pack or the bottom of the heap. And as he studied this, he reached a counterintuitive conclusion for someone at Harvard, which was, it was actually the very principles of good management taught at places like the business school that, while helpful on the way up, ultimately spelled every organization's demise. It may be very intuitive to you all here, but in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it was a surprise. So the senator said, I went to Harvard Business School. I actually stayed on afterwards to write this book so I could unlearn every single thing I learned there. And I think I've done so rather successfully. So we'll let you guys be the judge of it. But the theories that were developed to explain why this was in this counterintuitive set is really, it became known as the disruptive innovation theories. And disruptive innovation is really the causal mechanism that underlies the process through our economy known as creative destruction. It's really the process underneath creative destruction that Joseph Schumpeter described that's at the heart of free enterprise, that really drives every transformation we've seen in every sector in this economy. And we actually believe it has a very powerful role in explaining how we can transform even something as ossified as public education as well into something that's a student-centric enterprise to deliver on the challenges that the Senator mentioned. So we think it's a really important part of what we're coming at. And so what I thought I'd do today is briefly describe to you the basic theory itself. And I'll tell you some stories about how it's played out in some other sectors way removed from education. And then we'll turn and say, how does it explain the rise of a force we see right now in public education that we think can have this transformative power? And what does it mean for policy so that Georgia can really seize hold of this and be a or even the leader in moving this forward? And because I think the potential here is quite promising for reasons I'll talk about. So if we dive right in, basically what you can do is describe any market, as I've done up here in the slides, with these two axes, with performance on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And basically what you see in every single market is that there are two trajectories or two lines of improvement that are pretty interesting. The first one is this relatively flat one. It's the pace of performance that customers can utilize or absorb over time. And the reason it's relatively flat is because our basic lives actually don't change that much from day to day. The problems you had to solve yesterday are something like the problems you'll have to solve today and something like the things you'll have to get done tomorrow, right? It basically doesn't change that much. Now, of course, there's a range. There's some people at the low end who are satisfied with very little in the way of performance, and there's some people at the high end who we all have the misfortune of working with, who are never satisfied no matter how much you give them. Basically, we're relatively content people. But now there's a different line here, which is really interesting. It's the pace of technological progress. And what it says is that every technology, when it enters a market or a sector, it comes in as not good enough for the majority of customers or users in the sector. So it has to plant itself at the low end there. But what it also says is that technology improves much faster than do our lives change. So what at one point is not good enough for the majority of us, over time it predictably and reliably packs in more and more functions and features and performance such that it actually overserves what most of us can use from a technology. And it happens every time. I'll give you a quick example. How many of you remember the early personal computers in the early 1980s? Show of hands. You guys are a more honest audience than a lot of the ones I speak to. But so you remember strolling up to those personal computers and you'd sit there clacking away at them on the word processing. And every once in a while, if you also remember, you'd have to stop. And you'd literally have to pause because the stupid thing, you'd have to coax it to catch up with your fingers. Remember how primitive it was? Because the basic Intel microprocessor, the Intel 286 chip inside those early machines wasn't even good enough for a basic application like word processing. But true to form, Intel improved that microprocessor year over year over year, until now they introduced Pentium multi-core whatever processors that greatly overserve the ability of an ordinary user like myself to need all of the speed they can deliver. Now, it happens to be at Georgia Tech that there's some researchers there that need more speed, but for the most part, most of us are overserved. Ordinary folk, we'll call it. Now, sometimes the march up that blue line are just small year-to-year incremental improvements. Other times, they're just giant breakthrough leaps forward that really stretch the imagination of what was possible. But what we realized as we studied this was that the giant breakthrough leaps and the small incremental ones, they're actually the same type of innovation because they sustain that blue line so that you can better serve the most demanding customers in a marketplace, make better profits often, and do better along that. And so it sustains that blue line, and we realized it's the same effect on the marketplace, and so we called it a sustaining innovation. And what we saw is that incumbents, the leading organizations at the beginning of that blue line, are nearly always the winners of battles of sustaining innovation at the end of that blue line. For some reason, and it'll become clear in a moment, but they're just so motivated to build better products, to to serve more demanding customers and make better profits, that no matter how technologically demanding or how high-flying a new startup comes in, they'll figure out a way to get it done, and they'll ultimately win the game of sustaining innovation. Now, there was a different kind of innovation that came along occasionally, and what I've done here is push that diagram into the back plane there. Think about it in the back of a three-dimensional thing there. And the products or services there tended to be complicated, expensive, inaccessible, really centralized, and only serve a limited few people. And occasionally we saw another kind of innovation come along, and we gave it this horrible word called the disruptive innovation. I say it's a horrible term because disruptive implies lots of things in the English language. Some of them in schools I've learned are not particularly good. But what we meant by it was something that transformed a marketplace by introducing something that wasn't as good as the backplane product or service as judged by the historical measures of performance, but introduced something that was so much more affordable, accessible, decentralized, simple to use, easy to own, and convenient, and often more customizable, that it enabled all these non-consumers that couldn't afford the backplane product or service to all of a sudden start having the benefit of it. And they would jump in there, and then true to form, the disruptive innovation would get better and better and better year over year over year, and people would start flocking out en masse into the new thing because they were delighted with something that was more affordable, simple to use, and accessible, and so forth, right? As it got good enough to do the complicated stuff in the back plane, and the world just transformed every single time. So let me just tell you a quick story, actually one other point, which is that entrants, startup organizations, historically have almost always won battles of disruptive innovation. For some reason, it tends to trip up the leading organizations, historically speaking. There's been some changes lately based on, we like to think some of the research, but some business people really getting a hold of this problem. Now, I'll give you an example to show you why this is, though. If you go back to the 1970s and 80s, the leading company at that time was this company called Digital Equipment Corporation. How many people remember Digital Equipment Corporation? Did anyone work for DEC? Okay, I'm in clear. Okay, so, because if you remember, DEC was sort of the Google of that era, right? It was the high-flying company, best company in the world. You'd go to places like Business Week and say, why are these guys so good? And they said the same thing every single time, which was they make not only these mini computers that are just the best in the world and employ the best engineers in the world, but even more important, they have the smartest managers in the world. The implication being if you guys were just as smart as them, you could be high-flying and great and so forth. But since you probably don't, you know, you're second best to these guys. But an interesting thing happened to DEC, if you remember, in 1989. Just this high-flying company, within 6 months, literally the company just collapsed. The business just fell apart. And so you'd go back to Business Week and say, what happened? And they'd say, those stupid managers, very same people running the company. Those stupid managers, if only they had seen the personal computer coming, they could have caught that wave and transformed the world, but they missed it. So they're going to be consigned to the ashtray of history. Now, the question, this is the exact same time that Clayton Christensen entered academia, and so the question he also brought with him was, why do smart managers decide to become stupid? But it didn't make sense in this particular case because every single mini-computer business collapsed in the same 6-month time period. Data General, Prime, Wang, Hewlett, every single one. And while you'd expect companies to collude on price occasionally, to collude, to collapse, was a bit of a stretch of the imagination. Yet every single one did. So something more fundamental had to be going on. The stupid manager theory made no sense. And if you dug back into the story, indeed something else more fundamental was going on. What was happening was that if you went back in the 1980s, you'd see that DEC made these unbelievably complicated machines called mini computers about the size of the podium, so they weren't particularly mini, but they were smaller than mainframes, and sold it to very demanding corporate and university clients and so forth. And they were able to charge $250,000 and get 45% gross margins on these machines. And they did what the whiz kids at the Harvard Business School told them to do, which was to listen to their best customers, who said, gosh, if you just build a next-generation mini-computer for us, we'd be delighted to give you $500,000 and 60% gross margins. So that sounded pretty good. Another group came to them and said, Don't listen to your best customers. You got to trust us on this. If you just get up out of your seats every once in a while and actually look at the world, there's this thing coming called the personal computer. And I'm telling you, it's going to change the world. So management, they weren't totally lazy. They got up out of their seats, and they saw the personal computer. And they saw that people seemed to be adopting it, but they saw a few other things. First of all, personal computer as it existed at the time could barely do word processing. Right? It was a crummy machine at first. Secondly, they built a few of them, and they brought it to their demanding customers and said, hey, look what we just built. Would you buy one? Say, not a chance. We can't use that at all. And then they looked at the business plan, which said you could charge a couple $1,000 for this and 40% gross margins in the good years that were quickly going to collapse to 20%. So the decision management, in essence, faced was, should we build better products for our best customers for better profits, or should we build worse products that our customers can't use and won't buy for profits that would kill our business model? What should we do? It's a true innovator's dilemma, right? Because the very logical thing is to go up market. It's the thing we teach everyone at the business school. But the act of doing so, if you don't figure out a way to do the quote-unquote low-end thing, is the thing that's going to catch you in the wave. And so they did the very logical thing. So it's actually a story of quote-unquote good management, built bigger and better. And by 1989, the personal computers had gotten good enough that the volume just got sucked out of that market, and all the mini-computer businesses collapsed in unison. Now, interesting question is, how did Apple and all the personal computer companies, how did they transform the world? Well, in the case of Apple, if you noticed, when they got their start, about the same time that Home Depot got its start, they didn't have any customers. So they had this real benefit, which was just to say, I wonder who would want a personal computer. Do you remember who the first personal computer was sold to? Anyone? It was a toy to children and hobbyists, right? Because they couldn't afford these big, expensive mini-computers, but they'd love to do some computing. So this thing wasn't crummy at all. It was way better than the alternative, nothing at all. And it got its start there against non-consumption and got better and better and better and changed the world in a way that's a blessing to us all, because now we have affordable computing at our fingertips. Almost nearly all of us does. It's made it accessible to the world over. And it's this process of creative destruction or disruptive innovation that's led there. Now, not so good for Digital Equipment Corporation. And in fact, what I've done up here is put in the blue column the stocks we wish we had owned over the last couple of decades. I didn't own any, which is why I'm here. But they've been disruptive to those companies in red who in their own right were at one point disruptive as well. And you can go through it and see the same story repeat itself over and over again. Just take automobiles there, the top one. And what's a more familiar story, Toyota and the Japanese have disrupted the Detroit automakers, right, over the last several decades. How did Toyota do it? They didn't start at the high end with the high-flying Lexuses that everyone drives around now. They started the low end with this crummy car called a Corona. Anyone own a Corona? There we go, some honest people back there. It rusted pretty quickly, right? It wasn't near as good as the gas-guzzling cars that Detroit was shoving down everyone's throat, but for people that couldn't afford those gas-guzzling cars from Detroit, this was a blessing. Started there, they got their foothold, and then went up market to the Tercel, the Corolla, the Camry, the Avalon, the 4Runner, and then the Lexus, and changed the world. To be fair to Detroit automakers, the managers there, they actually weren't totally asleep at the switch. They saw these guys come in every once in a while. They said, you know, really ought to go down to the low end there and compete with those buggers. And so they'd send down a Pinto or a Chevette. But when they compare the margins of selling one of those vehicles with the unmitigated blessing of being able to push out yet another Cadillac Escalade or a Ford Explorer, it just didn't make any sense. So they'd retreat back up market, cede more ground, and by the time they really figured it out, they went to the government in hand declaring bankruptcy, and it was a little too late. So we've seen this process. Now, interestingly enough, Toyota has been being disrupted over the last many years as well. They didn't feel it until recently because they had privilege of stealing market share from Mercedes-Benz. But does anyone know who's been disrupting them? Just call it out if you do. Kia, Hyundai, the Koreans, right? They're actually not being too shy about it. This is an advertisement that Hyundai is running right now. It says, isn't it time someone did to Lexus what Lexus did to Mercedes? They basically own the subcompact and compact ends of the market, right? They're winning all the quality awards and just taking dead aim, and there's not much Toyota can do about it. Underneath them are the Chinese and Chery. And underneath them are Indians and Tthe, who I'm sure will never be good enough. But that's the way this process works out. Department stores. Used to be 300 plus department store full-service chains around the country. It turns out that there's about 7, 8, 9 maybe today. They've been disrupted by discount retail. Kmart, Walmart, Target. If you've noticed recently, Target's gone up market and become Target. And online retail has come up underneath them, right? If you actually notice, Amazon.com, right, has been hugely disruptive. You might say to me afterwards, well, Target.com's doing all right. Do you know who runs Target.com? Amazon, exactly. So really interesting. Third row is interesting, too, as we start to pivot toward education. State universities were largely decentralized, maybe not disrupted, but decentralized by community colleges over the last 60 years or so. Community colleges made it far more accessible for many Americans to get post-secondary education, to the point now over 50% of students in post-secondary education go to community colleges, actually, in this country. And online universities have definitively been disruptive, as they're growing roughly 20% a year right now, as the rest of higher education is middling along at barely 1%. And if you go to where I live now in California, the state universities and community colleges are actually shrinking because their business model is fundamentally broken. Done in by the business economics of it, but also because online education is just such a disruptive force, making education far more accessible and convenient to people who have to continue on with their lives and work and all these other things that make it actually a lot better from where they sit. And by the way, you can build it around education. We'll get to that in a second, and learning itself. Now, we see this force happening in K-12 education. And if you think about it, that would seem to be a good thing. Affordable, simple, accessible, convenient, customizable. That sounds like a pretty good thing right now in these budget times and so forth for our education system. And it's taken root, online learning is, as a disruptive innovation in the K-12 system in just where you'd expect. These areas of non-consumption, and it's just starting to grow into the mainstream now. And so what I've done here is just put up a huge list of areas of non-consumption in our K-12 system. Basically, these have just emerged from people. I travel around the country, and people say, you missed another one, and so I add a bullet point. You can go through these and see that online learning, and that is where you're learning on a computer, but with a teacher who's guiding you and so forth, is just growing rapidly in each of these areas. Credit recovery is a huge area of non-consumption. Before online learning, students would often fail a course and have basically no way to make it up outside maybe a summer school packet, or even often in the inner cities, they would just move on. You'd failed geometry and you just move on to Algebra 2, even though it turned out those concepts proved pretty critical later on. And then you'd get to graduation day and everyone would act shocked that you didn't have the number of credits needed to graduate. Online learning has been hugely valuable here, and Georgia's actually been an early leader in creating policy to explicitly target credit recovery with the Georgia Virtual School across the state and create this area to serve students that need this option of online learning. We've seen it in dropouts. 30% nationwide of our students are dropping out. Figures are probably familiar to you. In the state of Georgia, I believe it's about 61,000 students in 2010 did not graduate on time with their high school class. 61,000 students. Huge areas of non-consumption where online learning put into an alternative school model, much as communities and schools has been doing with their performance learning centers in Georgia. There's about 24 or so now open across the state in partnership with districts. These are basically dropout recovery or dropout prevention schools that wrap the supports around students and allow them to learn at their pace and path with online learning in really convenient ways. And it's growing like rocket fuel in those areas. AP and advanced courses are another one. I won't go through all these, but I'll just stop after this. AP courses, there's roughly 34 advanced placement courses that are offered, I believe. I haven't come across a high school yet that offers that full menu of courses, and yet it turns out that there are students that want access to AP courses in those schools, and online learning is a way to affordably and accessibly deliver it to them. It turns out the story is much bleaker than that, though. 25% of our high schools in 2008 across this entire country did not offer an advanced course, defined as anything above geometry. So forget about Algebra 2, forget about calculus, forget about trigonometry. Defined as anything above biology, so forget about chemistry, forget about physics. and defined as anything above honors English, period. Now, we talk about needing to graduate more engineers and mathematicians and so forth in this country, and yet we can't even offer physics. 25% of high schools. We've got to figure out a way to do this. Online learning allows you to do it. Now, the state of Georgia in the mid-2000s, and I don't know what the number is now, had roughly 440 high schools and 88 certified physics teachers in the entire state. In the absence of online learning to break apart the geographic barriers and so forth, how are you going to educate all these students? Really important that online learning has been stepping in and starting to do that. And I was also reading in some policy briefs that, the Senator and Kelly provided me about the remediation challenge when you get into higher education. This is a huge thing to basically save thousands and thousands, millions, I think, of dollars as you go for the higher education system so that students can get prepared and get to higher education at the level that they should be when they're really attacking their classes and their studies. We could go on, but what we're seeing is that the looming budget shortages, I think it was $2.6 billion or so was cut from the Georgia budget in 2010, and teacher shortages across the country. Actually, they at first seemed like a threat to the way we've always done business, and they are. But they're actually an opportunity to implement more disruptive innovation, more digital learning, so that we can actually transform the system. And I'll talk about why that's an important thing in a second. But I want to first tell you that it's actually happening in ways that you can just say every disruptive innovation does. And I'll be brief on this, but whenever you see a disruptive innovation enter a market, it follows an S-curve pattern. That is, on the left-hand side of that S there, if you take a look at that, people just sort of creep in and use the new innovation. There's a lot of rapid iteration. People aren't sure about it. It's new. It's not the same. And then at some point, the world flips, and people rapidly adopt it, and then it levels off at the top. The challenge is if you're in that early part of the S-curve, how do you know if one is developing? It could be a straight line to nowhere. It could be a really rapid S-curve, a slow developing one. Turns out there's a way, if you do some mathematics and put it on a logarithmic axis as the percent of the new divided by the percent of the old. I won't go into the math exactly, but it basically flattens that S-curve so that when the market's just 1, 2, 3, 4%, you can predict that when it'll hit 25, 50, 80%, if an S-curve is actually developing. If that straight line doesn't linearize, then you can say an S-curve is not developing and it's not a disruptive innovation. And it turns out that online learning at the high school level is following just this S-curve pattern, which led us to predict that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. Now, when we came out with this prediction in 2008, a bunch of people thought we were nuts because they said public education could never move that fast. And then an interesting thing happened about 6 months in. They said, we still think you're nuts, and they were right, but we think you're nuts because we actually think you're too conservative on the projection. We think it's moving faster than you guys said. I sort of plead the fifth. I think it'll be plus or minus a couple years on either side of it. It'll be roughly accurate. But there's a lot of data that's suggesting that it is moving pretty fast now. Over 4 million students are doing at least one online learning course, says Ambient Insight, which is a market research firm, in 2010. And according to a little bit more aggressive analysis from Project Tomorrow, 30% of high school students took at least one online course in 2010, and 19% of middle school students did. That's up from 45,000 students in the year 2000, 1 million in 2007, 4 million in 2010. So it's growing pretty rapidly. Question is, first of all, public schools are actually grabbing hold of this, and they're doing so in a lot of different ways. 39 states have some form of online learning initiative. 30 of those states have supplemental state-led programs, meaning where we're offering a la carte courses. Here you can take geometry, you can take Algebra 2, and so forth. Georgia Virtual School is an example of this, but for reasons we'll talk about, it's significantly smaller than some of the ones I've put up there, like the Florida Virtual School, your neighbor, most significantly. And 27 states allow full-time programs. Full-time online schools. Georgia's in that category. They've got a school operated by K-12 Inc., approved some charters for a couple more, and then the funding got all haywire and crazy here, which is another issue to talk about entirely, but it's something to really think about with virtual charter schools and how that gets funded and really dig in and improve that policy in Georgia right now. And the last part about it is that really this isn't a state-run online school thing anymore. This is a phenomenon of districts getting directly into the game increasingly. And the reason they're doing it is to serve non-consumers, dropout recovery students, credit recovery students, advanced courses, and homeschoolers who are leaving their system in their midst. And we see in Georgia that districts are aggressively doing that. Gwinnett County is one of the leaders in district programs, jumping out in front and really offering options. Now, there's some questions about that, and we'll get into that in a second, but some really optimistic things going on in Georgia all around this that makes it hard to figure out where we are, but know that Georgia's leading a good measure of this. Now, question is this all a good thing? And the answer here is I think it is. And I want to just start with something which I think is all relatively intuitive to probably everyone here, but took academics a little bit longer to catch up to, which is that we all have different learning needs at different times. I think it's fairly intuitive that, you know, some people, if you just watch, you know, you have a couple kids and you watch them playing on the ground, you could see that they learn things kind of differently, right? Some people absorb information really quickly. Some people like to play it out to learn things, et cetera, et cetera. What I've put up here is just the academic food fights that have developed over the last couple decades around what are the differences in which we learn. It started with this theory of multiple intelligences in 1983 out of Harvard, basically saying we have 8 different kinds of intelligences, ranging from the familiar logical, mathematical, and verbal linguistic to the less familiar bodily kinesthetic, basically asserting that the ability of the stellar football players at Georgia Tech to do what they did on the football field are actually resident in the capabilities of their mind. That would be a shock as maybe the bigger news item. But despite that, a bunch of people have pushed back on this and fought back. I don't want to get into this completely. The real takeaway here is that no one disagrees about a couple of these things. No one disagrees that people learn at different paces. Some people grab onto material really quickly. Other people struggle with it for a longer period of time. No one disagrees that that depends upon subject or domain, and that we all enter every single learning experience with different levels of background knowledge. And so, if that's the case, wouldn't you expect that if we wanted to create a public education system that would maximize everyone's potential, that we'd have a system that would customize for those differences? Sounds logical, right? But the education system we have wasn't built to do that. It wasn't built actually with a focus on learning at all. It was built on a focus of sorting people in and out to sort them into careers. And it was built along the design of a factory model. That is, to batch students up, put one teacher in front of them, make them all learn the same thing at the same time, at the same way, at the same day, and then spit them out the other end. We do this at Harvard Business School brilliantly. We all entered, you know, it's funny, right? We all entered at the beginning of the year, and then for 2 years they just added value to us. And then we shipped us out into Wall Street, and it's just been miraculous if you've been noticing. So, turns out this factory model system is a pretty crummy way to educate people. And yet it's exactly what it's built to do. And now that the job has changed, we're actually saying we need you to educate people because these jobs are tough. We need people with really big skills, really who can think on their own, can have lots of content mastery and so forth. This has changed fundamentally. And so online learning represents this transformational, disruptive potential to structure a system around learning where time would become variable and learning would become constant. So everyone, before they moved on to the next unit, would actually learn what they did. I'm not going to go into the economics of all this right now, but you can do it affordably if you move the content delivery to the form of the computer or digitally. Now, I want to clarify one thing, though. This doesn't mean that just shoving computers into the current system will transform anything. We've spent over $60 billion by a conservative estimate, by a more aggressive estimate, over $10 billion a year right now, equipping our schools with computers, and it hasn't changed a thing. It's been a waste of money. And it's because if you layer computers onto the existing factory model system, ain't going to change a thing. And that's exactly what we've done. It's what all organizations do when they see a potentially disruptive innovation. But in schools, we've shoved them into the back of classrooms, said you can do a little PowerPoint. And if you come out with this, gosh, help us. But we've said you can do some Microsoft Word, maybe even some internet searching. That's exciting. We've set up computer labs where we said you can do some keyboarding, learn how to type and use a computer as though our kids today need that. But we've never fundamentally transformed the instructional model, and that's exactly what online learning is doing. By going to these areas of non-consumption, it fundamentally transforms the relationship for the student and transforms it from this monolithic factory model system into a student-centric one. That's the potential. Now, the question is it delivering on that potential? So I feel really confident we're going to hit that projection of 50% by 2019, but I think it misses the point. Because the real purpose is to make our system more affordable and customizable and student-centric. And there's some really exciting things on that front, and then there's some big question marks. The exciting things are that technology, like it does in every disruptive innovation, is predictably improving. So quick question for everyone. How many people, when I said online learning, thought distance learning? You guys are smarter than most audience. A few people did. It's not at all, it's where it started. In 1989, that's where online learning started when the University of Phoenix debuted it. But increasingly, it's a blended learning or a hybrid learning phenomenon. That is that we're snapping the online learning into brick-and-mortar schools where students can go to get this learning, and there are teachers around and so forth. And this has become such a big part of the evolution of this field. In fact, it's our projection that 90% of online learning in K-12 will be in blended learning circumstances. So we'll still have schools, we'll still have football teams and so forth, but the learning will happen very differently. And it's become so big that we did a report recently, The Rise of K-12 Blended Learning, where we defined what we meant by blended learning. And it's any time a student is learning at least in part in a supervised brick-and-mortar location away from home, and at least in part through online delivery, where there's some element of student control over the time, the place, the path, and/or the pace. In other words, the things that make it individualized and disruptive. And that's really important because all these other things are not blended learning. Simply having a smart board like I am right now and beaming online content at you, that's not blended learning. Hasn't fundamentally changed the learning model at all. It's still one-to-many teacher, one teacher to many students delivery. Simply giving digital textbooks, that's not blended learning either. It's just a textbook digitally. It's not what we're talking about here. And lastly, one-to-one laptops in and of themselves are not blended learning. They may be a precursor and a requirement to do blended learning, but by themselves, it's not blended learning. So that's the first way we see this improving. And it's important because the majority of students, for socioeconomic reasons and the family structural reasons, will need to go to schools. And by the way, they like to have fun with friends, and so that's an important thing. Now, the second way it's improving is that the communication vehicles in online learning are improving dramatically. This is a screenshot of a company called Illuminate that was acquired recently that provided virtual classrooms whereby teachers could communicate with students, teachers could communicate with teachers, and students could collaborate with other students the world over. How many people here, though, use Skype? Almost everyone, gosh. So that's a free way, right, of doing video communications with anyone, anywhere, right? And just imagine how much more that technology is going to improve over the next 10 years. I don't even think we can imagine where this is going, but as three-dimensional screens are coming online, touch screens and so forth, this technology is going to be revolutionary, such that the communication ability in a global marketplace where we have to compete globally, it's going to be amazing the way this is going to connect us in some really profound ways. The third way this is really improving is that the content itself is improving dramatically. Now, if you went back to 1989 with the University of Phoenix's first online courses, you would have seen it basically was a correspondence course put online. It's flat, uninteresting. Even the courses through the 90s and even early 2000s tended to be pretty flat and uninteresting, like my PowerPoint presentation. You kind of click through it, and there was a bunch of multiple choice at the end, and it wasn't very dynamic. It wasn't clear how this was going to customize. We're starting to see some breakthroughs in that. Starting to see some breakthroughs. This is a screenshot from Florida Virtual School. They introduced the first video game-based American history course a few years ago called Conspiracy Code. In it, students run 10 missions to save American history from becoming corrupted. Many of you may joke it's too late for that. But for many students, this is an intensely motivating way that hits where they are to learn American history. And importantly, it's not for everyone, and that's the point, that we could have different paths to learning American history, but we would all learn American history. And what's really interesting about this is that they're starting to expand it into other arenas now and so forth. And the content, I just can't imagine where this is going to be in 10 years from now as the market works its forces on this, both in and even more outside of schools. Now, here are the question marks, though. And I titled it Practical Implications, but it really probably should be called Policy Implications. Because in public education, at least, policy and regulation create the market, for better or for worse. So while we can see that online learning as a disruptive innovation is growing, whether it'll be truly student-centric depends upon the wisdom of our policies. And right now, a critical takeaway from that is that we cannot be beholden by the old metrics of performance, because you've seen that for a couple reasons. One, if you judge a disruptive innovation by the old metrics of performance, A, it doesn't look particularly good, but B, you'll consign it to do the exact same thing that it's replacing. And if we come back here in 2019 and 50% of all high school courses are online, but it's still a factory model education that gets 30% dropouts, don't think we're going to feel pretty good about that result. And so the key is not to judge it by the old metrics. So what are the old metrics on which the old school system is doing so well? Well, it turns out that the biggest one is seat time. That is, we pay money for students sitting in seats, regardless of how much they learn. Now, I'd submit to you that we've been judging the wrong end of the student for the last 100 years. But this is how we pay and reward schools, based on whether you're sitting in the seat, not based on how much you learn. So the biggest thing here is to get out of this seat time business and allow students to move on when they've truly mastered something. And if they need more time, that's fine. But when they've really mastered something, a lot of them, I bet you it's going to surprise us, are going to accelerate beyond belief. There's a school district where I'm from in California, Los Altos, that's recently implemented the Khan Academy. How many people have heard of Khan Academy? A bunch of you. Sal Khan, he's this ex-hedge fund trader who basically makes videos for his cousins. Started out, he put them on YouTube explaining math and science concepts, and it's taken off virally. Millions of people around the world now learn math and science informally for free from Sal Khan. And so the school district actually put it in their 5th and 6th grade and some of their 7th grade classrooms and just said, well, we'll let them go at their path and pace. Turned out that students now in 5th grade are doing trigonometry and calculus. Not everyone, but a lot of them. Can you imagine that? How much we've been holding them back? It's education malpractice when we were making them do 5th grade math before. This is crazy. But this is how we reward the system. So seat time is the important thing to get rid of. And Georgia has taken a big step forward with House Bill 186 recently in that regard. It's opened up competency-based approaches for the online learning courses. And what I'm really encouraged by is that it's given a number of performance ways that you could realize that. So it's not just the state test, but there's a bunch of other avenues contained in that bill that will advance it. My caution would be that some of my friends that I've heard from some of the online learning sources have said that it's still just a few courses that it'll allow, about 3, I think. So that's a question. But then the second one is that the regulations are getting written by the department right now. I think it will come out in 2012-13. Pay close attention to those regulations because that's where things die. So pay very close attention to what happens there. These other lists of things that are really important, the geographic boundaries and teacher certifications. Lisa Gillis, my friend, who's one of the blended learning leaders in the world, she used to be in California with me. We had these boundaries in California where you were not allowed to serve a student by online learning unless they resided in the district or a contiguous district. So that means that if you were in Los Angeles and I was in San Francisco with the program, I could not serve you through online learning. This is insane. Does Google say you can only search if you are next to Mountain View, California? This is craziness, but this is the policies we have in place. This extends, right, though, to intrastate restrictions as well, or I should say interstate restrictions. We need to be able to have people to learn from wherever. If you've got 88 certified physics teachers in Georgia, we've got to be able to pool talent who can teach physics anywhere, any place that they might be. That's really critical. And so breaking apart the teacher certification notice rules and so forth is really important. In general, this can all be summarized as moving beyond inputs and processes to just worrying about the outcomes. Right now, our public education system micromanages every single process of how you would do every single thing, such that by the time you get down to an innovator on the ground, it's actually hard to innovate. It becomes the exception, not the rule. We need to turn that around and focus on outcomes through competency-based learning approaches and so forth. And that ties into the last thing I'll talk about here, and then we could go on, but for time's sake, I'll be quiet, which is moving to a self-sustaining funding model. So the Georgia Virtual School, I'll use that as an example right now, gets its money based on an appropriation from the state each year. It's basically a double funding tactic. And therefore, there's a cap on how many students can be served through the Georgia Virtual School or online learning programs in general. The reason the Florida Virtual School has grown so much is because they get funds for any student. The funding follows the student down to the course level. And it's the student gets the choice. No one can block that student. The other critical part, though, so the self-sustaining funding model is critical to allowing organic growth. The other critical thing that Florida did, and Utah just followed this past year, is that they tie some funding based on successful completion. So you don't get it all up front just for serving the student. You get a significant portion only when the student successfully completes the course. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Well, it was kind of revolutionary in the current system. But so this becomes a really critical thing because it reinforces then competency-based learning, outcome-based learning in really strong ways and says, hey, we don't care how you get there. We just really want to make sure that you know this stuff and can do it and can make yourself valuable as you leave education and as you enter the workforce so that you can contribute economic competitiveness both for your own future as well as America's. The potential is huge on this. We can talk about the dynamics of it far more in depth, but the power really right now is in the policy that can really unconstrain this and let it grow organically to serve students in a student-centric way. And that's the message that I'm bringing forward. I think Georgia's made some big steps forward in this, and what I'm hoping is that in the next year or two, they make another gigantic, you guys all make another gigantic step forward to really lead the country. Because honestly, if we can have 5 or 6 states similar to Tommy Thompson's Wisconsin with welfare reform as the model that really advances, then we'll have a model for other states to really take this on and really transform our education system and take advantage of this disruptive opportunity that we have before us. I have a lot of faith that we can do it. I have a lot of faith that you can do it. And so that's why I'm here today. So I appreciate your time. Look forward to taking a few questions. Thank you so much. So I guess same thing, right? There's a, yeah, go right here, yeah.
As an online teacher and traditional teacher as well, I'm seeing the online, there's kind of a regression going on right now. The online classes did start asynchronously and have all those benefits, but now they're working into virtual classrooms and things like that. And so they're trying to turn the online classrooms back into the on-ground classrooms. You just do it online. So
Yeah.
what do you do about that?
So I'll repeat the question so everyone could hear. The question was, he's both an online teacher and has been a traditional teacher as well, or maybe you do both now. Do both now. So, and the observation is that the online started as an asynchronous experience. That is, you could learn at the time that made sense for you rather than when the entire class was meeting and that was the only time you could learn. But what's happening is that the online experience is increasingly morphing into the on-ground experience and requiring synchronous and so forth. So a couple comments. I think part of it is that these seat time rules and so forth constrain you to actually have to look like the existing system, and that explains part of the behavior. One of the questions about the content, I showed that great screenshot of Florida Virtual School content with the game-based course. Question is, why has the market not produced more of that? And it's because we don't incentivize it, right? There's no incentives around quality. There's just incentives around serving and seat time still. So that's the two main headlines. The other thing I think, though, is that I think what you're likely to see is a mixture of asynchronous and synchronous be the dominant mode, depending on the student's need. right? So having discussions, online discussions and meetings, or in blended learnings cases, being able to come out of your self-paced and have a discussion with a group of students or a small group or whatever it might be, is actually a pretty critical skill that you would want to see that will cement knowledge and so forth. And for many students, being socially involved is a good way for them to learn. I think what we want is to have all those avenues so that you can pick the ones that make sense for your own learning experience and get you to those objectives. We ought to worry about the objectives, no, not the policies. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is the NCAA recently issued some regulations saying that they would judge the admissibility of online courses to determine academic eligibility for athletics based on the way that the teacher interacted with the student. I think it's the wrong focus, again. Let's focus on what we want the student to know, and then let the program figure out the best way to get them there, whether it's asynchronous or online classrooms and so forth. And students can help start to move this as well. I think we have it backwards right now, I guess is what I'm saying. The last thing, I think this is an interesting story about the value that online classrooms actually can have, which is, I was speaking in I think it was New Jersey or Vermont, a more liberal state, and the students there were addressing a constitutional question. It was a government class in high school, and they were working simultaneously with students in Utah in this online course, a more conservative state. And the students were just absolutely shocked that at the end of working through this process, they had reached the same conclusion that those students in Utah had done. And I thought the teachable moment there was pretty critical, right? And just worth thinking about the value that that can promote actually as well as another set of skills. So, good question though. Mike's coming to you right there.
So Brian Hill, how are you doing? And
Good.
Thank you, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can find a way to make Georgia move further towards this. Question, we've always had, it seems, tied age to grade, and you mentioned a lot about K through 12, and does this, and obviously would this allow children to continue to advance according to what their output is, not necessarily their age, and obviously the goal would be to allow those kids that can advance at the rate that their education drives that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So grade-based system is just is a relic of the factory model. If you go back to the one-room schoolhouse, that's not at all how it operated, right? You'd have lots of kids and a teacher that was individualizing everything. What happened was the need to mass educate in the early 1900s. The factory model was the only economic model we had at the time to figure it out. And progressives actually at the time encouraged that we adopt that. We have networked models that now allow for all this mass customization in every other field. And so the grade level and all those things start to fall apart. The nice thing about the blended learning model in particular is that online learning, so we've always had this problem in the factory model system, which is that if you advance people at the rate that they're learning, they leave their peers, or alternatively, they get held back with peers that are significantly younger than them. And there's a social trade-off there that we have to be honest with is real. The flip side was just as bad, though, right? We would just socially promote you, even if you hadn't mastered stuff, and then your gaps became bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where when you were in 8th grade math, your problem wasn't 8th grade math. Your problem was actually maybe division back in 4th grade, but no one had ever figured that out. And by the way, the teachers there didn't know how to teach that because that was not what they were trained in. So the nice thing about online learning is it breaks that trade-off finally, because I can be in a cohort of people that continue to move with my peer group, but academically I can be doing the calculus in 5th grade while the guy sitting next to me is doing what we've traditionally thought of as a 5th grade math topic. And that's a really big benefit, I think, of this. Neil, we're all the way in the front here. Hold on one sec, we got the mic coming. Otherwise, I got to repeat the question. And
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. High tech, high touch. The 60,000 kids you were talking about who are part of the dropout pipeline or even dropping out represent maybe there's 30% of the kids in the whole district. 30% of the children we aren't reaching. How do we take their personal needs, which has been missed in the traditional system, apply a high touch model to that in the context of the high tech? In other words, we want to make sure we need high touch, and we need high tech to teach us about high touch, maybe. So
Yeah.
how would you respond to that?
It's a great point. And I think what you'd see, gosh, there's about 5 different ways to attack this question. But so what I think you'd see is that some students need less touch, right, than we provide. And a lot of students that are not being reached currently actually need a lot more touch. And the reason that they're falling off the rails often isn't academic in nature per se, but it's all the other things that get in the way, life basically, of family situations, not eating properly, whatever it might be. There's a huge range of factors. What I think you'll see in the future, if we do this right, is a few things. If we just worry about outcomes and give the school sites the ability to allocate resources as makes sense, I think what you're going to see is a lot of the adults in the future are not going to be traditional teachers as we've thought of them, but really sitting there, as your program does, Communities in Schools, to put the non-academic supports around the student so that when they get to the lesson, when they get to the learning time, they're ready to learn. And I think we'll free up schools to be able to make those decisions that make sense for their population. And in every single case, I think it's going to look different. I suspect a couple other things. One, I suspect in the future we're going to have a multiplicity of teacher roles in the future, or adult roles. And I'll just give my theory on it, but I don't know that it's true, and you shouldn't take this to the bank. But I could easily see that we'll have content experts in the world. You'll have people who are mentors and motivators, learning coaches, and then you'll have caseworkers who handle all the non-academic problems. And then you might have the extreme caseworkers who handle the really deep ones, right? And that actually should be a really good thing, because teachers right now, we expect them to be a jack of all trades. We have this, Waiting for Superman was this sort of mythical movie that lionized it, and their conclusion was, well, we can't wait for Superman, we just need to wait for people that can all spend 120 hours a week. Well, we have 3.5 million teachers in this country. Good luck. There's never been an industry that's scaled that way. So being able to differentiate teacher or adult roles and so forth, I think will be really important. The third thing I'd say is that there's this really strange argument that happens among education reformers versus what we'll call them the traditionalists, which is how many people are familiar with Harlem Children's Zone in Jeffrey, Canada? People familiar with KIPP, I'm sure, as well. So there's this no excuses crowd, and then there's the crowd that says, well, it's all the other things, poverty and so forth, right? So you look at what KIPP is doing, and you look at what Harlem Children's Zone is doing. They're taking care of all those things so that they can deliver great outcomes of learning. So yeah, there's actually not much disagreement. We just don't need to foist it on all these social services and so forth. Schools can actually do this if we empower them to do it. And I think that as technology becomes better and more affordable, it's going to commoditize a lot of the learning so we can put dollars against those problems where and when it makes sense. One more question? Okay.
Hang on, I got
The mic is moving that way, and then Kelly will kick me off.
Yes, knowledge is great, and self-actualized education is really important. But how do you teach values in that laboratory? I mean, values and knowledge are so closely aligned, and the outcome so closely tied to what your values are.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I would be the first to say it's not my area of expertise, but it's a really important point. So I'll put that caveat in front of it, and then I'll give you a quick answer, which is why it's another reason why I think the blended learning model is going to be the dominant one in K-12, because what they're going to represent is more than schools. They're going to represent these places where the community comes together to have those conversations about what its values are, and enter into those conversations about what we can be. And that's the other part of the high touch, I guess. But that's where that happens. And so you can learn the academic stuff anywhere. You can do that today. You literally, you can jump on. There's enough free resources. You can do that. You can do that. Now, it's hard to find it and so forth, so we need teachers and mentors and so forth. That's one function of the school. I dare say that the more important function will be that community-centered model that anchors us and roots us in the values. It's why I think, people laugh at me sometimes when I always say this, but, athletics, I think, is going to be a huge part of that. Teamwork, valuing how you work with people. There's books written about how you learn more on the football field than in kindergarten, right? I think all those places where those conversations happen and communities come together and rally together are going to be absolutely critical. And you can imagine in 10 years that the school of the future will be this very open place where you come for the things you uniquely get in your community and at school. And lots of people will be working there in very different functions from today. And you could be learning algebra, geometry at home in the evenings maybe, and then you come in for orchestra, you come in for marching band, you come in for football, whatever it might be. I think that's a very distinct possibility and would be a pretty rich way to think about the civic fabric of our life in the future. So, great question. Thank you.
Special round of applause. Michael got up this morning and took the red eye from California so he could be with us today. What a day. On behalf of CPLI and the Foundation, let me thank you all for coming today and spending the day with us. Thank you to our volunteers and our sponsors that made it all happen. You have a tremendous amount of educational material out on the tables as you exit. We really don't want to take that home with us. Take it, hand it out to your friends. Got pocket constitutions. We're always handy. Thank you again to everyone. We're dismissed. Have a great weekend.